Welcome to Insights in Sound, where we talk to the people behind the scenes, behind the technology, and behind the music. People you may not know, but you should. And please check out getitInwriting.net/shows for a full list of our podcast YouTube series.
My guest is inventor and engineer Dave Rossum. He is one of the founders of Emu Systems, inventor of the polyphonic keyboard, sampling synthesis. His fingerprints are stamped all over legendary products like the Emulator, the Drumulator, the SP12 and 1200. First of all, welcome, and thank you for your time. Thank you for joining us.
Glad to be here.
I'd like to start with a little bit of your own background because in researching your background, I found something that was really interesting to me, which is that you, as you put it in one interview, you have sort of a love-hate relationship with music.
Ah, yes.
You tell.
That's it. It's quite a story, and it's taken me many decades to figure this out, or at least have some clue as to what's going on. I grew up in a well-to-do family. We weren't rich, but we certainly didn't want for anything. In San Jose, California, before Silicon Valley really was Silicon Valley.
When San Jose was just a bedroom community.
Yeah. And we had a cherry orchard across the street from us. And Dad was a chemist. He was the chemist for California Water Service Company. So, and Dad was very much a scientist. He'd gone to Caltech. And I loved science from my very, very early days. And had an affinity for music. Now, my brother, John, is quite a talented musician. In fact, I think he would have been in Jefferson Airplane if he hadn't gotten drafted, because he was taking lessons from and playing with Jorma Kaukonen and Paul Kantner just before they formed the band.
Oh, wow.
But John got pulled off, drafted, but even in the Vietnam era, he was very lucky. He ended up being a chauffeur for a general over in Berlin.
Ooh, yeah, he got very lucky.
Very, very blessed with that. And but John started taking piano lessons when he was 7 years old. 7, probably 8, because I was 4 at the time. And I wanted to be like my big brother, who was taking piano lessons. And I had perfect pitch. At 4 years old, I could come into the room and someone would play a note on the piano. I could walk over and point to which key they played.
Wow.
So, but my parents said I was too young to take piano lessons, but I whined and cried until they said yes. But they said, if you start, you have to continue for a year. Well, they were absolutely right. I was too young for piano lessons. The piano teacher also wasn't particularly good with very young children. And I was pretty sick and tired of the whole going to lessons, having to practice things within a month or two. And my parents relented, and I didn't have to continue. But as I grew up, and again, like I said, I've only put this together much later than it happened. My dad never much liked music, and learned at some point that was because he was raised by a single mom, and he was told that the reason he didn't have a father in the household when he grew up was because his father was a musician and a drunk. So Dad always associated music and musicianship with an absent father.
Wow.
And I think that was why he didn't particularly like music. Mom liked music. So like I say, John was very talented, but as I grew older and got more into science, I sort of shunned music just because that's what Dad did, and I wanted to be like Dad.
The subtle psychology of that is really interesting.
Yeah, I know. Like I say, it's very common.
Yeah.
But I would when nobody was home, I'd go down to the piano, or later my mom got a electronic organ, and work out songs and keys and things like that on when nobody was around, so that nobody would know that I was fascinated by music.
So you were a closet musician.
I was yeah. That went on, even through college. College, of course, there was music all around, and I enjoyed music. But I never took up any instruments. I never learned to play anything. Didn't until I got into the music industry understand the deep relationship between music and mathematics.
Oh yeah.
And I think that I discovered that earlier, I might have been legitimately drawn into music, and maybe even talked my father into, you know, this is science, it's not music type of thing. And I think that affinity, along with the love of technology and a love of inventing. I've always loved to invent things and figure out tough problems and come up with out of the box solutions and so on.
Well, that's what I was going to bring up, is that there's still not only the mathematical bridge, but I think in terms of being an inventor, I think there's a lot of commonality there with the creative process. The same way that musicians are, we sometimes say we're solving problems.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah, and
I think it is. It's
very,
creative thinking. It's problem solving.
yeah, and I can really relate to many things that my clients, musicians, say about the creative process, particularly in analog design, which is I think I've said before in interviews that that's my true love is analog design. I've done a lot of digital design, and I'm very comfortable moving between the two, which is a very nice talent to have in this world.
And necessary.
But analog design is very much an art. It's very creative. I do come up with circuits that come out of dreams and things like that. So there's a great deal of creativity there.
And analog design also, I think, as you've pointed out, I mean, it seems to be less precise in certain ways. There's more room for creativity and flexibility in that sense, which is, again, a commonality with music and any creative art, really.
Yeah. I mean, I suggest a different choice of words. I'm not even sure what the right word is, but I don't think precise is it. But digital design is really very cut and dry. It either is doing what it's supposed to do, or it isn't doing what it's supposed to do. Whereas in the analog world, you want it to be precise, but you have to be concerned about how precise is precise enough, and all the variations that can happen. But the other thing about analog design is the number of happy accidents that you make along the way is much greater than what happens in the digital world.
I think that's what I was trying to get at. Yeah, the idea that digital it's digital. It's one or it's zero. It's kind of binary.
Nothing in between.
Yeah, it's exactly what you get. Whereas analog, you can fudge things.
Yeah,
it's not all moon and June. There's barriers and borders that you can push and guardrails that you can go up against. I mean, you can't break the laws of physics, obviously, but I can see a really good argument for the correlation between just problem solving and inventing, especially in the analog domain, with musical arranging and songwriting, in the sense that they're fluid.
Right. Now, to not leave out our many digital engineers that may have been slightly insulted by what we said so far, the same is certainly true in the digital world. That
no question.
In the early days of DSP, I was very much aware that the design of pitch shifting algorithms for samplers and so on, you were going to have errors, and the key was making sure those errors were in places that could sort of be swept under the rug. Although once in a while, like with the SP1200, the aliasing in that algorithm is something that's become very beloved by people.
Yeah, I think we've, it goes back to the whole concept of a lot of what people were doing in the 60s and 70s with, here's what we think this is for. Now, what happens if I use it for that? What happens if I just try something different? To me, that's That's a creative approach. And yeah, you're right. It's definitely just as easy to do in the digital domain. I think what's kind of cool is the idea of bringing that mindset from the analog domain into working with digital, because not only does it help you to push those borders, but it's a great way to integrate the two worlds, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
And you've certainly done a good job of that. Yeah. Let's go back on the timeline a little bit again. You got interested in synthesis pretty much by just an accident of timing, with having a Moog modular kind of land in your school's lap.
Yeah, exactly. I was heading off to get a PhD in molecular biology, and my advisor, who was also a musician, invited me to come help the music department unpack their Moog, even though neither of us were in the music department. And I was just immediately fascinated. And
Clearly, yeah.
yeah. So
Mhm.
that was a big switch in my life, and I didn't quite know how I did it, but I managed to just traverse that bridge out of deep and heavy duty science into starting my own business.
Well, and I think, a lot of the best careers are basically just tangentially based. Now, this was still at a point in Moog modular development where it was a monophonic unit, right?
Oh, absolutely. I'm not even sure anybody besides Emu had a polyphonic keyboard in the modular world. Since I wasn't a musician, I was, certainly at UCSC, and after we started Emu, I was, hanging around and listening to the musicians and what they had to say. And the first question was always, how come I can only play one note, or how come I can play two notes, but that's all. And uh, I at Caltech, my degree is in molecular biology, but I'd been very interested in applying computers to the science of biology, and so I did take all the computer courses that I could take at Caltech. They didn't officially have a minor in information science, but I would have had one if they gave such things. So it wasn't that big a jump into electronics. I hadn't done any double E courses, but I'd done all the computer courses. So I knew computer logic pretty well, and I very quickly figured out that the low note, high note thing was just logically the wrong thing to do if you wanted to make a truly polyphonic keyboard. And with the training I got in computer design, there was not that big a step to come up with the computer logic that would actually do what you wanted to do in a polyphonic keyboard. Now, there were some choices as to, when did you reuse a voice and things like that. And our original polyphonic keyboard had the famous sometimes, always, never switch.
Yes.
um, so, but yeah, I mean, it was very early on that I designed the polyphonic keyboard. That was basically as soon as we could build a synthesizer of our own that had more than two voices. We did the prototype of the thing, and it certainly was a vision of ours to do that. But it was quite expensive until we came around with the S10 chips.
There again, what I'm fascinated by is the fact that you attack these problems from an engineering perspective. I wonder if the fact that you were a non-musician, or as I said, a closet musician, that music was not your primary motivation, gave you a different paradigm.
I think that's definitely it. Scott Wedge, the co-founder of Emu with me, he was a high school friend. And similarly, he was not a musician himself, but caught the synthesizer bug pretty much the same way I did. And we look back at the modest success of Emu, even in the 70s, and certainly when we came up with the emulator in the early 80s, that so many of our friends that had started a synthesizer company built their synthesizer and then went off and played it, and they never did the next step. And Scott and I were like, okay, we've got here, what do we do next? What's the next interesting, if you like, engineering problem to solve? We love talking to the musicians and sort of decoding their language into something that we could turn into engineering.
I think that's the art form right there too. That's the secret of it, is to be able to decode that, to be able to have the intrinsic vocabulary to be able to say, okay, I hear what you're saying, now here's how I execute that.
Mhm.
And that's probably got a lot to do with coming from a different perspective.
Yeah, yeah. A kind of funny story in that regard. One of my very good friends, Kevin Monahan, who was a long time Emu employee, starting about the emulator range and going on well past the acquisition by Creative. Um, when we hired in a new CEO, um, uh, his name was Charlie Ascanis, and he came to me and he said, "This guy Kevin Monahan, uh, I ask everybody in the company, what he does, and nobody seems to know what he does, but everybody says I can't fire him." Uh, and what Kevin did, he was the sort of marketing engineering intermediate guy. He'd put on a lot of different hats over his years at Emu, but he was somebody who was just so incredibly talented at going out, hanging out with the power musicians, the celebrities, and so on. And he loved to do that. And just be part of their world, and then he'd come back with these insights that he'd share with the engineers as ideas that we could put into the product. I've said many times, and continue to advise people that I work for, that the best thing that people can say about their product that you've designed is, "I love the product and I can't tell you why," because then your competitors can't copy it.
Well, that's probably a good point. I do really think though that there's an advantage to being multifaceted like that, where you can speak in multiple tongues, so to speak.
Yeah.
Be able to speak musician and be able to speak engineer. There's an art to that, I think.
Yeah, yeah. And at Emu, almost all the engineers were musicians of, diverse backgrounds and so on. And that brought a lot of creativity into the group. And then when you all got talking together, the brainstorming stuff and the ultimate products,
Mhm.
really benefited from it.
The other thing that fascinates me is the entire era that Emu was a part of. This was a fledgling industry in so many ways, both on the recording end and on the synthesis end. And it must have been really fascinating to be a part of that and be so influential and in turn influenced by everything else going on around you. It's like looking over your shoulder and seeing what other people are doing. That's more inspirational than anything else.
Yeah, I mean, it was like being a kid in the candy store, and particularly with the microprocessor revolution happening in the
Yeah.
in 75, 76, 77. That I'm not sure really whether Roland or Emu was the first one out with a microprocessor based product, because they had their MC8 microcomposer
Yeah.
that, from all the records, was pretty much contemporary with when we put a Z80 into the polyphonic keyboard and added a sequencer and so on. I think there's no question that our product was way more sophisticated than theirs. Well, they were using an 8008, we were using an 8080, or a Z80. So, but what you could do with microprocessors during those times, from the mid 70s to even the late 80s, when we started getting into the world where we could design, a little company like Emu could design its own ICs, digital ICs, and signal processing ICs, and so on. So, like I said, it was like a kid in a candy store. What do I do next? I used to laugh because people would write me emails and say, "Oh, I have a great idea for a new product, and if you'll design it for me, then we can split the profit." And I'd write them back and say, "I have so many great ideas of mine that I don't have time to develop. Why would I want to do one of yours?"
It's true. It's true. But no, you're absolutely right. I think, Moore's law was in full force at that point, and
Yeah,
literally everything was, the next generation of everything was so much further advanced than the previous generation that, I mean, I think every year, most of us in the industry, let alone musicians and lay people, were just absolutely amazed at what would come out. the development of technology over those couple of decades was just absolutely astronomical. And you guys definitely you set some pretty good landmarks there in terms
Yeah.
of and what I think also must be very satisfying is to have those landmarks identified with certain cultural issues, like the
Oh, yeah.
SP12 and SP1200.
Yeah. I mean, that's the neatest one of the bunch to me. Just been involved in really the genesis of a musical genre, and I can't claim any more significant part than just throwing in an instrument that I had no idea it was going to do that. But the love that folks have for that instrument and that sound is that's why I do this sort of thing. Is that, I hand it off to a musician and they can express themselves in a way that they haven't been able to do before. That's really fun. It's really rewarding.
Yeah, that must be very, very rewarding to know that you have created something that is now doing things you didn't necessarily expect it to do.
Yeah, yeah. That is my favorite thing when somebody grabs something and takes something that I thought was almost a bug and turns it into
A feature.
a musical revolution in some cases.
Yeah, it
Mhm.
must be such a pleasure to then just watch, and not just once or twice, but the continued rebirth of this. I mean, the SP1200 coming back again
Yeah.
and coming back into vogue again for a whole new generation. I know that you had a pretty close relationship with Dave Smith, and you guys were probably about as friendly competitors can be.
Yeah, it certainly had its ups and downs. In the early days, you know, it's kind of funny because sometimes I think of Dave Smith as a kid, and sometimes I think of him as being older than me. Yeah, and in reality, he's about 6 months younger. Um, and the last time we were together at the uh, 2020 January NAMM show, I went up to Dave's hospitality suite. He invited me up there to come hang out, and we sat next to each other. And we discovered that we grew up in the same area of San Jose, about 5 or 6 blocks from each other. And we would have been in the same high school class, except for his parents decided that he needed to go to the Catholic high school, Bellarmine, instead of Willow Glen High. So we just missed that much from being high school buddies like Scott and I had been.
Man, I love it.
But yeah, in the early days of Sequential, we were really close. And then there came a time, it was actually when the transition happened between the Rev 2 and Rev 3 Prophet, that we had done I'd actually done all the analog design for the original Prophet. I knew the SSM chips, and Dave was not much of an analog designer. He was the first to admit that. And he developed all the software for the thing on our development system. We had a Z80 development system, and so on. And then there were problems with the productions of the SSM chips. The company that was making them, and the company that owned the designs, SSM itself, was more interested in it being a cash cow than moving forward to solve customer problems. So Sequential designed out the SSM chips and then stopped paying Emu royalties on it, which of course we didn't like because we'd been counting on it. This resulted in a lawsuit between the two companies, and we were not very good friends for several years there. And in the end, we settled the lawsuit, and the thing that really was the deciding factor in re-cementing that friendship after that was just before Sequential went out of business, they paid off the very end of the payments for that lawsuit, just before the window of bankruptcy could have taken it away. So it was kind of a nice gesture of saying, yeah, no hard feelings coming out of this. And I certainly took it that way. And since that time, Dave and I became better and better friends. And when I rejoined the music industry after my cell phone stint, in 2015, saw Dave at the NAMM show. He gave me this huge hug. So much invited me back into the industry, and he gave me all the help he possibly could, and so on. It was really a warm welcome, and one of the big reasons why Rossum Electro happened and prospered.
Yeah, we all have our great relationships in this industry, and that's one of the best parts about it, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's a nice segue into something else I wanted to ask you about, which was the transition into Creative Labs world and all of that.
Hmm.
It parallels again the development of our industry from, you know, a whole lot of backyard garage little industries into a much more corporate setting, which is, you know,
Hmm.
obviously where we live now. And I wonder how that was for you in terms of adjusting to that whole feeling of, you know, having to grow up, so to speak, and be adults in the industry and run
Hmm.
businesses.
Well, that motivation for going out and looking for a partner like Creative Labs um, was, as a small company, and we really didn't have any access to any significant capital at all. Unlike Evan Brooks and Peter Gocher of DigiDesign, Peter's father was quite an investor type of person, and so they got introductions into the business world. And Scott and I, his dad was a physicist, my dad was a chemist, but they were both scientists. They weren't in the financial world. So, we used to joke about it, that the problem being in the music industry is your customers are always broke. But we had this roller coaster of success, but every product had to be a home run coming out of Emu, because the company couldn't survive if we didn't have great products every so often. We the financial trees that we could run the airplane into and have it crash we were flying the airplane much lower than typical big industries. And we looked around us and saw, in particular, the multimedia computer industry, the technology in the sound world there was pitifully bad. And that was what we did, is made our pitch into that world. This is why we hired Charlie Oskanis as a CEO, was to give us parentage, is what we call it. And we all knew that Creative was the multimedia giant at the time. They just had the Sound Blaster accepted as Microsoft standard. So we were all set to do a deal with another company, much smaller company, but still way bigger than Emu. And at the last minute, we got an in into Creative, and the three Singaporean founders of Creative flew over and spent an afternoon with me. And I learned later that from the guy who ended up being my boss at Creative, that afternoon they decided they were going to buy Emu. Once they had a talk with me, that was like, that was a done deal on their part. It was nice in a way compared to many other acquisitions. I mean, there were two things that happened. The first was when Creative finally we first did a licensing deal, and then we started talking acquisition, or they started talking acquisition. And Charlie Oskanis came into my office and said, I've been invited to go to a business talk with them about acquisition. And he said, you and Scott are going to be the least popular people in Santa Cruz if this goes through, because they're going to just cut up Emu like a Christmas turkey, and it'll be no fun for anybody. And we said, well, we ought to listen to what they say before we turn them down. So we sent Charlie over, and he came back just grinning, and he said, they were very explicit. They want to keep Emu as a music company operating exactly as it is. They just want access to the technology. And that's why they're buying the company.
That's reassuring.
And it turned out that was very much true. That that was 1994, and through the end of the 90s, they funded a number of Emu projects. The whole Emulator for family came out under them, and the ESI and so on. A great many wonderful products, all done under Creative. So I've always tried to reverse the meme that says, Creative ruined Emu, because that was not the case. And the other thing was that because Creative had gone through this insane explosion of a company when they suddenly became the multimedia standard, they had no infrastructure. So when they acquired Emu, if they looked around for various pieces of infrastructure, they could often just copy what they bought with Emu. So rather than our having to conform to all of their systems, they, in at least quite a number of cases, adopted ours.
But then there really wasn't that much of an environmental or a cultural change within Emu, if that's the case.
That's correct. And another thing that uh, Creative was a company that didn't take themselves all that seriously. They were, they had uh, you know entrepreneurial roots that like us, we didn't know what it meant to found a company, then we just did it.
Mhm.
And so that all fit in pretty well, particularly when we realized that the other folks had a sense of humor. Now there's always frustrations, and there certainly were occasional turf wars and things like that. And later on, there were a few big mistakes that were made, between the companies that I can't blame anybody for, but it's just what happens when big companies get gobbled up, or little companies get gobbled up by big ones. But all in all, it was a good experience.
Yeah, that tends to be an arc that almost all companies have. They have the climb to success, and then typically there is a decline after that. And that's a cultural thing too. And they get a little bit too large little bit too large, and sometimes a little bit too hubristic. It just happened.
Yeah.
But I think for most people observing it, I think the perception was that Emu went pop. Emu was no longer the indie band that everybody liked. They got popular and they had a hit single. There was this perception, oh, you guys went commercial. So it's nice to hear that culturally that was not really the impact at all.
Yeah. And again, I think you look factually at particularly the Emulator 4 family, which is very much loved by a great many people still.
Sure.
All of that was done under Creative. I think there is some truth that once we had parentage, we weren't as hungry as we had been previously. I think another big thing is just the specifics that when they aren't causally related, but right when we got acquired by Emu, Marco Alpert, who was a very key person in Emu through the 80s and 90s, early 90s, left to go to Akai. And so we didn't have as close a relationship in between engineering and marketing as we had previously. And I think that hampered things as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, losing a big creative resource, but also to your previous point, I think as with many, many great artists and songwriters, if you're not hungry, you're not as inspired to really reach for it, so to speak.
Yeah. And of course, the other thing that was happening right at that time, really at the beginning of the millennia, software synthesis was becoming feasible on general purpose platforms, and as a result, hardware was becoming much less popular. And I myself was never really interested in writing plugins. I like designing hardware. I feel that musical instruments, I want to be able to touch and feel what it is I'm creating, rather than to deal with a mouse and a screen and so on. So I never encouraged the company to go into plugins. I think we made one software product, the E3X, or I think that was called, or the Emulator X. That was what it was called, not the E3X. The Emulator X was a software version. I've never even played with that myself, but
obviously your heart wasn't in it.
Nope.
Yeah, that was actually what I was going to lead into, was how that particular phase of the technology revolution impacted you, and obviously your return to the industry as a hardware guy again. Tell me a little bit about that.
Well,
you took a break, obviously.
As Creative's fortunes dropped over the first 10 years of the millennium, I was still chief scientist there. I was still working on fun projects and so on. But just about 2010, 2011 is when they pretty much finally dropped supporting Emu. We'd lost enough money, and it was less that we'd lost any significant amount of money to them than just their entire business was coming under pressure. and Sim, the CEO, explained to me that I've got to cut back everywhere, and so we got to cut back here. So pretty much when they shut the last little bits of Emu down was when I resigned my position there as chief scientist of creative, and got recruited by some friends to go work for a company developing chips for cell phones. That's the technology that when you talk on your cell phone, it ignores all the other sounds besides your voice. It's a company called Audience, and there are half a dozen, maybe a dozen ex-muons there that dragged me in, and I became ultimately the senior director of architecture there, which was a lot of fun designing, architecting these huge DSP chips.
Yeah, that's a challenge.
And the in cell phones, power is absolutely everything. So I learned a huge amount about how to design digital ICs for very lowest possible power, and in the audio world came up with a number of inventions for that and so on. It was like it was a fun job. I was working with friends. I was working with bright people, but one day my wife and I were at a movie. I don't remember what movie it was, but it was peripherally associated with the making of music, and I was crying, and I realized it was because I just missed that involvement with the making of music. Right about that time, Marco left Antares and was looking for something else to do before he retired, and said, you want to start another company, Dave? And then Bill Putnam at Universal Audio heard this and said, well, if we can get some of Dave's time for Universal Audio as well, UA will invest in Rossum Electro. So that sort of made it a deal. And then we looked at a number of different things when we started out as to what we might start with, but ended up again with invitations from Dave Smith and a great many other people in the Eurorack community as well. We got back into Eurorack, kind of full circle with the modular world, and that's been really fun.
It's a nice way to dip your toe back in too, in a way.
Yeah. So,
and
I've gotten to do both analog and digital stuff there, which is what I like. So that's
clearly the stuff that you've learned in cell phone technology has benefited this, and I think that's always I'm always a fan of diversity in a career. And I think clearly you've done that, and I think now coming back into the industry from where it stands now, that must be an interesting perspective, sort of re-entering after, how long was your break?
About 5 years, 2011 to 2010, 2011.
Yeah, that's a semi-eternity in dog years, and in electronics years, I think that
Moore's law doublings. It's
exactly.
You're pretty well deluded by that point.
Yeah, I mean, was there a bit of reorientation, so to speak, coming back in? I mean, I assume you always kept an eye on things, but was it different coming back into because not only is the industry different now, but the industry that we serve, the music making industry, and the commercial recording industry and all that, and live sound, those things are so much different now too. Was there kind of an adjustment to that?
Well, I much less so than there could have been, because Eurorack is still modular. And that would we were so into the modular during the first 10 years, these formative years, and those same principles were still there. How you made things. Well, again, the way you put together a module, it's surface mount, but other than that, a lot of the engineering is very much the same. So actually, it was remarkably easy to get back into the full swing of things. And then, of course, in the digital technologies, I'm also a technical fellow at Universal Audio, and there I'm in the algorithm group, which has people that know, 1 or 2 orders of magnitude more mathematics than I do. But it's still DSP. It's still the way we did things for the algorithms in the cell phone world. I also had people working for me that knew way more mathematics than I do. Um,
It's always great not to be the smartest guy in the room, you know.
oh yeah, yeah. But it's fun to be there with a lot of other smart people. I mean,
It
that's
is.
and that's some of the joy I really love in working this group at UA, is they are so smart, and yet they think I'm smart. I have no idea, why, but they do.
You know, that enables all of us to hang out together and share ideas, and that's never a bad thing.
Yeah.
You know. So what's your feeling about the current state and the future of our industry? What do you say to somebody coming in the industry now?
Well, you know, people coming into this, the one thing has always been true, and it certainly was true at Emu, is a lot of people want to work in this industry. So, here at UA, at Emu, we really have the choice of the best people. People would come in to Emu and want a job, and we really had the ability to, look, okay, who is really, really talented, really, really bright, really, really driven, just because people walk in the door all the time and you say, I'll come work for you for free. That's what we couldn't do that. But I think for people that want to get into this really technical end of designing products for real music production, work like hell. Get educated. It's not going to be easy. Don't give up is the other thing. Persistence is everything, and pick yourself up if you fail one point. The standard advice for anybody, but it's doubly true in this industry. As far as where the industry itself is headed, it's a little mysterious to me. The modular world is so much more diverse than it seemed to be back in the days of the Emu modular. I'm delighted. One of the things I love about Eurorack is the fact that there's just people who just do it because they love playing with sound.
Mhm.
And that's a wonderful use for modular. It's can be very meditative, very relaxing, as well as being really challenging, really interesting. The sort of thing that you can, go to bed. How can I put something together to make the sound I want, and so on, and wake up in the middle of the night. Oh, I see it, and so on. So that's wonderful stuff, and I love the Eurorack world for that. I'm not the sort of guy that wants to design modules that are incomprehensible. I like it. I like things to be understandable. I almost went into education instead of science when I came out of Caltech. But had I done that, I probably would have never seen the synthesizer, and this would never have all happened. But I do love educating people, and that's part of my own personal design philosophy. But with all the different kinds of technology today, I don't want to say AI because it's kind of the wrong word. It's misleading. I mean, AI technology, meaning machine learning, is certainly going to be a part of our lives for quite a while. But just overall, technology is giving more people access to being involved in the making of music, and I think that's great. And I don't know where that's going to lead. We used to laugh in the modular days about people who would say, I'd like a synthesizer that can just read my brainwaves and hear the music I'm thinking about and create it. And
Any day
wouldn't we
now.
all? But it's getting to the point where it's not that, but it is certainly just much more accessible for somebody who doesn't have musical training and musical talent to still really effectively participate in the making of music.
Well, and as you say, I think the development of a less complicated user interface, which then allows you to be more right-brained more immediately, as opposed to having to learn so much about it before you can get into that phase of the creative process. That's kind of cool,
Yeah, and my feelings on user interface, and this showed up in a lot of I love products where you can walk up to it and you can sort of know what's going on and you do things in it it begins to do things you expect it to do. But I think part of music, and it's also part of, this is another place for analog design. You can get deeper and deeper and deeper into it, and learn more and more, and have more and more things at your fingertips, and so on. And so the instruments I love have an interface that isn't, it's simple to approach, but it's deep in terms of, as you learn more and more, you get still more and more ability to control and ability to explore and find places that nobody else has found and things like that. That's sort of my ideal philosophy of a user interface.
I always felt that the best instruments, the best user interfaces are those that you can immediately get a quick start because that part of it's intuitive. And then as you start doing a deeper dive, then you go back in RTFM here and there, and you say, oh, that's what that does. But the higher level understanding is something that should be much more intuitive.
Yeah. Well, the other thing that I realized, and I think this is very important, is that the ideal instrument isn't the unlimited sound generator. That again, a part of musician, and this is something I felt from the day I walked in and started playing with that Moog, that that physical and emotional relationship with the instrument is a part of the creative process and shapes the creative process, so that what the instrument does and how it does it and how it feels when you touch it and so on, all of that is going to shape the music, and very appropriately. So as an instrument designer, I am shaping your music to some degree, and that feels good. I mean, heck.
And to your point, I think each instrument has its limitations, and those limitations are, to me, part of the challenge of creating. If you have no limitation, it's the same thing like having unlimited tracks.
Right.
You have those limitations the same way there were limitations to a monophonic synthesizer. And we found ways to work around those limitations. We found ways to push that technology, whatever it was, a little bit harder to get what we wanted. And I think the fewer limitations you have, in certain ways you create less.
Right. Yeah. So we certainly see that in some of the incredible sounds that come out of the SP1200, because it only had 10 seconds. Oh my God, of sampling. But it again inspired this creativity in the part of the artist as to how can I get it to do what I want to do, that created this whole unique aspect of sound that then was perfect for what they wanted to express. My partner Scott used to talk about how there was a certain balance or tuning of the features in an instrument. With the emulator, I was looking at what's the sound quality, how much recording space does it have, how many different features does it have, and he understood that when all of those things are in tune, when there isn't one single strong point of an instrument and so on, that really made a usable instrument. That just brought to mind by what you said.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And I think you have done a very nice job of bridging past and present here. And I'm really interested to see what comes of the future, because it doesn't seem like you have any real intention of retiring anytime soon.
No, I won't. Karen, my wife, asked me, when are you going to retire? And I said, well, if I retired, I'd still be doing the same thing because I love it so much. So I might as well get paid for it. So,
yeah, it's a fair point.
Yeah, so count me around for quite a while longer.
I'm glad to hear that you're also very involved in education, because I think it's important to be able to pass that wisdom along to a whole new generation.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. That's what we're about, is passing it on. So,
absolutely. Dave Rossum, thank you for being my guest.
Oh, you're very welcome. It's been fun.
Hey, I'm Daniel Keller. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and join us each week for Insights in Sound.